Thanks for joining us today. My name is Brielle, and I'm one of the organizers of this year's quantitative seminar series for the Converse Lab. And I'll begin by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We also acknowledge that we live and work on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish people, the first people of Seattle. So today I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Michele Buonanduci. Michele is a PhD candidate in the Quantitative Ecology and Resource Management program at UW, and she is advised by Dr. Brian Harvey in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. Michele's research focuses on the spatial and temporal patterns of wildfires and bark beetle outbreaks in the Western United States. Her research aims to help forest managers prepare for how these forest disturbances and their impacts might change with a warming and drying climate. Before coming to UW, Michele earned a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Boston University and worked as an environmental consultant for many years in both Massachusetts and Colorado. So thanks, Michele, and you can take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Brielle. Let me just get my screen sorted. Okay. So yes, hello everyone. Thanks for being here. As Brielle mentioned, I am a graduate student in the Quantitative Ecology and Resource Management program at UW. And today I'm going to be talking about Western Cascadia wildfire, specifically spatial patterns of burn severity and the implications of those patterns for future ecological impacts. So this project is a collaborative effort between the University of Washington and the Washington Department of Natural Resources. And I'll say up front that it is very much still a work in progress. So to start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work. Dan Donato and Josh Holofsky are natural resource scientists with the Washington DNR. Maureen Kennedy is an associate professor in the Sciences and Mathematics division at UW-Tacoma, and also a QUIRM alum. And Brian Harvey is an assistant professor and my advisor in SAFS. I'd also like to acknowledge the funding sources for this work, including the Joint Fire Science Program and the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. So today I'll be talking a lot about fire severity, which we define as the magnitude of ecological effects of fire, or the proportion of vegetation killed by fire. So high severity fire is fire resulting in near total tree mortality, and the spatial patterns of burn severity within a fire shape the potential for forest recovery, which I'll talk about more in a little bit. I'll also be talking a lot today about fire regimes, which are a central concept in fire science. So fire regimes refer to the type, frequency, severity, and spatial dimensions of fire activity in a particular area or region. So here we have a conceptual diagram with two axes. We have time between fires on the x-axis, and then proportion of area burned at different fire severities along the y-axis. So broadly speaking, in areas where fire occurs quite frequently, the areas that do burn typically burn at low severities. And in areas where fire occurs very infrequently, the areas that do burn typically burn severely. And this is a continuous gradient, but we tend to classify fire regimes into low severity regimes on the one end and high severity regimes on the other, with everything in the middle sort of lumped into this mixed severity category. And these regimes vary strongly with biophysical gradients, so things like vegetation structure and topography, as well as climatic gradients. So in the forested regions of the Northwest, which are shown here, historical fire regimes range from frequent, low severity fires in hotter and drier parts of the region to infrequent, high severity fire in colder and wetter parts of the region. So a key word here that you'll notice is historical, because as you may know or could probably guess, these fire regimes are highly sensitive to changing climate. We're seeing increases in the number of large fires, total area burned, and burn severity in recent decades. And these trends have been linked strongly with warming and drying climate conditions. So, as climate continues to warm, some of the largest increases in area burned are expected to occur in regions where fire activity has historically been limited by cool, wet climate. In these regions, there is this abundance of dense and spatially contiguous fuel. By that I mean combustible, live and dead vegetation that can carry fire. And warming and drying climate is expected to make fire ignitions more likely. One such region, and the region that is the focus of this research project, is the high severity fire regimes west of the Cascade Crest in Western Washington and Northwestern Oregon. So this study region, which we're calling Western Cascadia, is highlighted here. And historically, the fire regimes in Western Cascadia have been characterized by very infrequent fire, with multiple centuries passing between fire events in a given area. However, fires do occur in this region, and when they do, they tend to be large and severe, with fire events potentially as large as 1 million hectares in size. So this region is the focus of a number of ongoing research projects that my co-authors and I, along with a number of collaborators and partners, are currently working on. So as the potential for fire increases in Western Cascadia, the goal of these projects is to better understand the characteristics of wildfire in this region. Now, due to the infrequent nature of fire in this region, wildfires have been extremely rare in Western Cascadia in recent decades, as shown in this figure. So here we have all wildfire events occurring from the beginning of the satellite record, which is 1984, through 2019. And you can see that the occurrence of wildfire drops off pretty dramatically west of the Cascade Crest. However, as I mentioned, wildfires in this region are rare, but they do occur, and when they do, they tend to be large and severe. So in 2020, wildfires west of the Cascade Crest in Washington and Oregon burned over 300,000 hectares in just 2 weeks in September. And these fires were devastating for the communities that they affected, but they were not unprecedented. For example, we know from recent history that the 1902 Yakult burn in southern Washington burned almost 100,000 hectares, as did the 1933 Tillamook burn in Oregon. So the 2020 fires really highlight the role that fire has historically played in these forests and the role that it will continue to play in the future. So as climate continues to warm, an area burned in Western Cascadia potentially increases. Research is currently being done to better understand the climatic drivers of wildfire in this region. So it's generally understood that small to medium fires may be driven by increasing drought conditions, whereas the largest fires may be driven by strong, dry east wind events coinciding with those drought conditions. That was the case for the 2020 fires in Washington and Oregon, which are shown burning here. And some of our collaborators are currently working to evaluate these climatic drivers and determine the relative likelihood of small versus large fire events in Western Cascadia moving forward. And while it's really important to consider the relative size of potential future fire events, it's also really important to consider what the spatial structure of wildfires in this region might look like. So the size and also the shape of high severity burn patches within fires determine post-fire forest recovery. And this is primarily because the interior portions of high severity patches can potentially be really far from surviving live trees following fire, and therefore really far from potential seed sources. So this distance to seed source, which is a function of the patch structure of burn severity, determines forest regeneration potential. So here we have, on the left, we have probability of post-fire seedling establishment. And on the right, we have density of post-fire seedling establishment. And you can see that both of these drop off sharply with increasing distance to seed source. So this means that forest regeneration is much slower or may fail altogether in the interior portions of those large high-severity burn patches. Because of this, very large high severity patches are where management intervention is often most needed. By that, I mean things like replanting with tree seedlings in areas that might be at risk for forest regeneration failure. Also, things like landslide hazard assessments, because substantial losses of vegetation cover make burned areas more susceptible to erosion and debris flows. While these patches are a real concern for managers working to protect forest health, it's also worth noting that because most trees are killed in these areas, high severity patches are areas where early successional pre-forest habitat forms. So that is habitat dominated by grasses, herbs, and shrubs. And this pre-forest habitat is incredibly rich in terms of plant species diversity. It also provides important habitat for a really wide range of insects, birds, and mammals. Indigenous communities in Western Cascadia historically used fire to manage the land and promote pre-forest habitat, which supports many culturally important species such as huckleberry. So all of this is to say that patterns of burn severity, and in particular, patches of high severity where most trees are killed, are important to anticipate, not only because they impact forest health, but also because they impact a really wide range of ecosystem services. So thinking about the spatial structure of fires, you can imagine that as fires increase in size, the potential for large, high severity patches also naturally increases or scales upward. We refer to this as a scaling relationship. So you can imagine that forests might face very different ecological impacts depending on both the relative likelihood of small versus large fire events, as well as the spatial patterns of burn severity within those fire perimeters. So understanding the range of patch structure that might be expected across a range of fire sizes in Western Cascadia will enable managers in this region to anticipate and plan for those impacts. So all of this leads me to the research question that we'd like to address, which is, what is the range of burn severity patch structure expected from fires of different sizes across Western Cascadia? Now, I'd like to emphasize here that the goal is not to predict specific burn severity patterns that we might expect in specific locations, but rather at a broad regional scale to put quantitative bounds on the types of wildfire patterns that characterize the Western Cascadia wildfire regime. However, going back to this figure that I showed earlier, we have really limited data for the spatial structure of burn severity west of the Cascades. So using the satellite fire record through 2020, we're looking at 30 Western Cascadia fires for which we are able to characterize spatial patterns of burn severity. So this really limits the statistical power that we have to describe these patterns and how they might vary with increasing fire size. We do have some information from recent history. For example, for fires like the Yakult burn in 1902, which I mentioned earlier, we have a general understanding of the area that burned. However, this type of historical information is fairly coarse and doesn't give us a clear picture of what the patterns and patch structure of burn severity looked like. So fortunately, we can look to a broader geographic region, essentially the forested ecoregions across the broader Northwest US, where fire has occurred more frequently within the satellite record. So by comparing the limited data that we have for Western Cascadia to other forested regions, we can evaluate whether the spatial patterns of recent fires in Western Cascadia fall within the range of patterns that we see in other regions, as well as other fire regimes. So, as I mentioned earlier, historical fire regimes vary widely across the Northwest US, with historically high severity fire regimes fairly prevalent both in Western Cascadia as well as over in the Northern Rockies. So if burn severity spatial scaling relationships for Western Cascadia are comparable to other fire regimes, such as the Northern Rockies high severity regime, then data from those comparable regimes could be harnessed to supplement the sparse contemporary record in Western Cascadia. So going back to our research question here, we have broadened it by asking, what is the range of burn severity patch structure expected from fires of different sizes across the Northwest US? Do spatial scaling relationships vary by region, fire regime, and/or time period? And finally, can data from other regions be harnessed to help quantify the range of variation in burn severity patch structure expected in Western Cascadia? All right, so getting into some of the data processing for this work. Our study region is the Northwest US, and we've broken that region up into two forested regions. So we have the Northern Rockies shown in the tan color, and then the Pacific Northwest shown in the gray, with again our Western Cascadia region outlined there in black. And we have assigned each fire event the primary historical fire regime within that fire's perimeter. So as an example, zooming in on this fire here, you can see that the area burned by this fire is composed of a mix of historical fire regimes. However, because the area within this fire's perimeter is predominantly that historically frequent low severity regime, this fire is assigned to that low severity fire regime group. And as a reminder, here are our Western Cascadia fires for comparison. So for each fire, we use Landsat satellite imagery and Google Earth Engine, which is a cloud-based computing platform, to generate maps of RDNBR, which is a satellite index of burn severity. And essentially it quantifies the difference between pre-fire and post-fire vegetation greenness. We then use statistical models calibrated to Northwest US field plots to classify that satellite index into two burn severity classes based on the proportion of trees likely to have been killed. So we have our high severity class where most trees are killed, and then everything else is low to moderate burn severity. Combining each classified burn severity map with available land cover data, we are identifying forested areas burned at less than high severity, from which we are then generating a map of distance to potential seed source within the interior of each high severity burn patch. Finally, we're using the classified burn severity maps to calculate patch size metrics for each fire. And we're using the distance to potential seed source maps to calculate patch structure metrics for each fire. Now I'm going to start by talking about the two most straightforward metrics I have listed here. So mean patch size and total core area. So for the size of high severity patches, we're using an area weighted mean rather than an arithmetic mean. So looking at this distribution of patches, an arithmetic mean would give us the expected size of a random patch drawn from this distribution, which would be around 20 hectares in this case. However, this is going to be less ecologically meaningful than the expected size that would be encountered if you selected a random location within this landscape. So that would be a much larger patch size, close to 1,200 hectares in this case. So that's our area weighted mean patch size metric. And then for total core area, again, we've characterized distance to potential seed source within the interior of each high severity patch. And we're using a threshold of 150 meters to define core area. And this is because 150 meters is the probable seed dispersal distance for many conifer tree species. And I think it's important to point out that, of course, not all area exceeding this 150 meter threshold is the same, right? You can imagine that areas close to 1,000 meters from seed will be even slower to recover than areas right at that 150 meter threshold. But this does give us a sense of the overall amount of area within the interior of patches that may require some sort of management intervention following fire. Okay, so now getting into some of the analysis. So to get you oriented to these spatial scaling relationships, here we have area weighted mean patch size on the left and total core area of fires on the right. And these are fires occurring in Western Cascadia. So we have log axes in both of these plots with fire size on the X and then our spatial metrics on the Y. So you can see the spatial scaling relationships that are starting to emerge. We see this positive relationship between each of these metrics and overall fire size. And what we would like to do is evaluate whether the burn severity patch metrics in Western Cascadia fall within the range of scaling relationships in other regions and fire regimes in the Northwest. So how are we going to quantify that range of variation? So for each subset of our broader Northwest data set, we're fitting smooth curves to the relationship between fire size and each metric using non-parametric quantile regression. So using a quantile regression approach means that instead of a line through the mean, we fit a line through the 50th percentile of the response. And we can fit lines through other quantiles of the response as well. So the inner band here represents the middle 50% of the response, so from the 25th to 75th percentiles. And then the outer band represents the middle 95% of the response. Because we're interested not only in the central tendency, but also the range of potential patch sizes with increasing fire size, this gives us a fuller picture of how that range of variation changes with increasing fire size. So these are our smooth curves fit using additive basis spline functions. And by using a non-parametric approach, we're not enforcing linearity or normality of errors, which often don't appear to be appropriate assumptions for these relationships. Okay, so first, looking at mean patch size, here's how the broader Northwest data shake out by fire regime and region. So again, we have log axes with area weighted mean patch size on the y-axis, fire size on the x-axis. We have our 3 historical fire regimes, high severity, mixed severity, and low severity. And then our 2 geographic regions, so the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest. And I'll point out that unfortunately there weren't enough data in the Pacific Northwest high severity regime for model fitting. So you'll notice that, this lower left panel is going to be blank. And so looking at these trends, you can see generally the trends are similar across regions and fire regimes, though there appear to be differences in the amount of variation in these scaling relationships across subsets of the data. And here's how the Western Cascadia data stack up compared to the broader Northwest. I'm going to focus in on 2 of these panels in a little more detail. So the first is the Northern Rockies high severity regime. So a region that is geographically removed from Western Cascadia, but potentially most comparable in terms of fire regime dynamics. And then the second is the Pacific Northwest low severity fire regime group. So a region that is geographically closer to Western Cascadia, but less comparable in terms of fire regime dynamics. So pulling out these 2 panels, you can see that, again, there are qualitatively similar trends, but a much wider range of variation for the Pacific Northwest low severity regime. We see that visually, the Western Cascadia data appear pretty consistent with the Northern Rockies high severity regime group. The central tendency line appears to be a good fit, and the data generally fall within each quartile of the response distribution. On the other hand, while the Western Cascadia data do fall within the range of patch sizes in the Pacific Northwest low severity regime, they appear to be limited to the mid to upper quartiles of that response distribution. We can confirm that the Northern Rockies high severity regime offers the best fit for the Western Cascadia data, which is what we expected. We do this using a quantile loss function, which is analogous to root mean square error, but accounting for the asymmetry of residuals when using quantile regression. So then moving on to our core area metric here, we have a very similar story. Again, similar trends across regions and fire regimes, but with differences in the amount of variation in these scaling relationships across subsets of the data. And once again, just zooming in on these 2 panels for comparison, we see again that the Western Cascadia data appear pretty consistent with the Northern Rockies high severity regime, which we confirm using that quantile loss function. And as we saw with mean patch size, it's interesting to point out that the range of variation for total core area in the Pacific Northwest low severity regime is much larger than that in the Northern Rockies high. Given our conceptual understanding of frequent low severity fire regimes, we would expect generally less severe fires and therefore smaller core areas compared to high severity regimes. We do see this in the low severity regime. We see that core area can be and tends to be much lower than in the Northern Rockies high severity regime. However, we also see that core area can be as large as what we see in high severity regimes. So what's going on here, and why might that be the case? Well, what this points to is the fact that a century of fire suppression in the United States has altered many historically frequent and low severity fire regimes. So historically, low severity regimes occurred in regions where climate was often warm and dry, and therefore conducive to fire. So fire would occur at fairly regular intervals in these systems, regularly killing understory vegetation and small trees, and maintaining forests with this rather open park-like structure. This meant that fuel, so vegetation, was often a limiting factor in these systems, so that fires that did occur tended to be less intense and less severe, with most overstory trees surviving. However, after a century of fire suppression, these forests have grown to be much more dense than they were historically. So now, when fires do escape suppression, fuels are abundant, which leads to more intense and more severe fires. We can visually see the differences in forest structure in historically frequent fire regions. So here we have a repeat aerial photograph of the same location in Eastern Oregon, the first in 1936 and the second in 2018. And again, this increased abundance and spatial connectivity in fuels is what has altered fire activity in these regions, and is likely why we are seeing spatial patterns in historically low severity regimes that sometimes appear as severe as those in historically high severity regimes. So this point is a bit tangential to our primary research questions, but I think it's important to highlight. Bringing it back though to our region of interest, which is Western Cascadia, what we found so far is that the Western Cascadia data fall within the range of patch size scaling relationships for other regions and regimes. They appear to fall within the mid to upper quartiles of low and mixed severity regimes, and are most consistent with the Northern Rockies high severity regime. And so our analysis so far has really focused on the question of whether these spatial scaling relationships of burn severity are stationary in space. But with the broader context of climate-induced changes and fire activity in recent decades, the next question we wanted to address was whether these scaling relationships are stationary in time. So we went about evaluating temporal trends in a couple of different ways. So first, within our quantile regression models, where we have this smooth term for fire size, we add a second smooth term for year. So here we have our models for area-weighted mean patch size. And now this is the marginal effect of fire size. And you'll notice that these effects are pretty comparable visually to the results from the model I showed earlier. And then here is our marginal effect of year. And so you can see that there's perhaps some year-to-year variation in these relationships, primarily in the mixed and low severity regimes. But we're not really seeing anything here to indicate an overall increase in patch size over time after accounting for fire size. And the story was qualitatively very similar for our core area models. Another way that we looked at this was using an interaction term of time period. So again, starting with our quantile regression models, where we have this smooth term for fire size, we can specify that that term differs by time period. And so for time period, we're considering an early period, which we defined as 1984 to 2000, and then a late period, which we define as 2001 to 2020. And that late period is when it has generally been hotter and drier than preceding decades. So for these models, it's easiest to compare curves for each quantile individually. So here we have area-weighted mean patch size for just the Northern Rockies high severity regime. And we're looking at smooth curves fit to 3 quantiles of the distribution. So we have the 5th, the 50th, and the 95th. We can then calculate the difference between these 2 curves along with a 95% confidence interval, which is shown here. And again, using this approach, we don't really find any evidence to suggest that the relationship between fire size and our spatial metrics have changed between these 2 time periods. And this was pretty consistent across fire regimes, and also, again, for our core area metric as well. So while total area burned at high severity may be increasing in recent years, which is what we see in this figure, what we can conclude is that this is likely driven by increases in overall area burned, not by changes in the spatial patterns of burn severity within fire events. So at this point, we've touched on most of our research questions. We've quantified the range of burn severity patch structure expected from fires of different sizes across the Northwest US. We have demonstrated that these spatial scaling relationships vary by fire regime, but not by time period, at least within the 30-year satellite record, so since 1984. So this leads us to the conclusion that data from the Northern Rockies high severity fire regime, which appear most comparable to Western Cascadia, might be useful in anticipating the range of effects of potential future fires in Western Cascadia. So now, if we pool together the data that we have for Western Cascadia in the Northern Rockies high severity regime, which is what we have here for total core area, what this enables us to do is a really small, simple simulation study to help illustrate the range of potential fire effects. So we can ask a question like, assuming 100,000 hectares burn, what are the potential impacts if this area burns as one very large fire, so 100,000 hectares, 10 moderately large fires, each 10,000 hectares, or 100 smaller fires, each 1,000 hectares? Because remember, an area of active research is parsing out the climate drivers of fire in this region and determining the relative likelihood of different fire sizes in this region moving forward. And this research is meant to be really complementary to that effort. So based on this very small simulation study, we see that if those 100,000 hectares burned in large fire events, so either one very large event or 10 moderately large events, we're looking at a doubling or more in total core area as compared to if that same area burned as 100 smaller fire events. So this is really straightforward to simulate for our core area metric and gives us a meaningful range of potential impacts. However, it's less clear how we might simulate and interpret potential impacts using something like area-weighted mean patch size. Because if you think about it, simply adding together mean patch sizes from a number of fire events would not tell us much about the overall distribution of patches we might expect to see across a landscape. So that leads me to the final section of this presentation, moving beyond the mean. So some of you may be familiar with the idea that many natural phenomena follow power law distributions. What this means is that their sizes span several orders of magnitude, with smaller values occurring much more frequently than larger values. So this has been shown to be the case for things like earthquakes, sinkholes, and even wildfires. And these distributions are not well characterized by their typical or average values because while most events are small, the largest events are the most impactful. You may also be familiar with power law distributions being used to describe the populations of cities or the wealth of individuals. I did also do some digging for this presentation and found that these power laws may even apply to the sizes of schools of fish. So what is a power law distribution? A power law distribution takes this form. So the probability of an event of size X is a function of some constant C and some scaling parameter beta. So the probability of an event decreases proportionally with the size of that event. If we take the log of both sides, we see that this distribution follows a straight line in log-log space. And beta determines the slope of that line. So it determines the relative prevalence of small versus large event sizes. Now, since power laws are frequently invoked in the fire size distribution literature to describe the distribution of fire event sizes either globally or across regions, we wanted to explore whether they would be useful for characterizing the distributions of patches of high severity within individual fire events. And this was really appealing to me as an approach because if it works, essentially it means we can describe the entire event size distribution with a single parameter, beta. And then we'd be able to evaluate how that one parameter varies with fire size. However, we quickly found out that this actually wasn't a great approach, and that patch sizes require a more flexible distribution. And this was, there are a couple of reasons for this. So the first reason is that a straight line in log-log space fits some patch size distributions well, but others clearly demonstrated a curvature in log-log space that could not be captured by a power law function. The second reason is that for patches within a fire, there is a clear upper limit to the largest possible patch sizes. So you cannot have a patch that is larger than the fire itself. So we need to account for some sort of upper truncation limit. So following an approach proposed by Hansen and others in their 2016 paper, we add another term to our power law function, psi, to add curvature to that distribution. And we add, or we account for upper and lower truncation limits through the normalization constant C, which takes this form. So what we have here is a truncated log normal distribution. We have an upper and a lower truncation limit. So we set the lower limit to 1 hectare just across the board, and the upper limit to the size of each fire event. We have a shape or a curvature parameter psi, which determines the separation of this curve from a power law. So when psi is 0, this function reduces to a power law function. And finally, we have our scaling parameter beta, which is the exponent of the power law when psi is 0. So this is what this distribution looks like. Here we have the probability density function at 3 values of psi, so negative 0.2, 0, and 0.2, and then a range of values of beta. And you can see, like I mentioned, when psi is 0, we have a function that is a straight line in log-log space. When psi is less than 0, we have this curvature upwards in log-log space, so a greater likelihood of large event sizes compared to the power law. And then when psi is greater than 0, we have this curvature downward in log-log space, so a lower likelihood of large event sizes as compared to the power law. And you might be wondering why for each value of psi, only a subset of the range of beta values is shown. And that's because when we start fitting this distribution to patch sizes, we find that these parameters are highly correlated. So as psi increases, beta strongly decreases. So how do we interpret this parameter space? Well, again, when psi is 0, we have a probability density function that is a straight line in log-log space. When psi is less than 0, we have this curvature upward, and when psi is greater than 0, we have this curvature downward. So these are all probability density functions fit to 4 fire events, each relatively comparable in size, so each between 2 and 3,000 hectares in size. And then these are the inverse cumulative density functions for those same fires, which I think are nice to show just because then we can easily plot the empirical data over them, so you can see how these curves are fitting to the data. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, what do these distributions look like spatially? So when psi is equal to 0, we have this burn severity pattern characterized by some large patches, but also many small patches. When psi is less than 0, we have a burn severity pattern dominated by one very large patch. And when psi is greater than 0, we have a burn severity pattern dominated by many small patches. So as we did with mean patch size and total core area, we can evaluate the spatial scaling of these parameters with increasing fire size. And for brevity, I'll show you just the high severity regimes. So here is our beta parameter for the Northern Rockies high severity regime plotted against fire size. And then here is our psi parameter, also plotted against fire size. And then the black dots here are our Western Cascadia data for comparison. So you'll see what we have going on here appears to be a convergence of parameters with increasing fire size, and specifically a convergence to a power law function with increasing fire size. So again, if you look at this psi plot where psi is equal to 0, we have a power law, and we can see that it is converging towards 0 as fire size increases. And I think that this makes sense mathematically in terms of sample sizes and truncation limits. So for smaller fires, we have a smaller number of patches that span fewer orders of magnitude. And so you can imagine that you're likely to see a wider range of distribution shapes that appear to deviate from a power law. For larger fires, we have a much larger number of patches, and their sizes potentially span several orders of magnitude. So as larger and larger patch sizes are expected, albeit at very low frequencies, these distributions begin to resemble a power law. I think this also makes sense thinking about the size and composition of burned landscapes. So here we have 3 fires that burned in Western Cascadia, one very large fire, the Beachy Creek fire shown on the right, and then 2 smaller fires, the Rock House and the Goodell. And I'll point out that the scales here are quite different. So you can imagine when fires are contained to small or moderately sized areas, they're more likely to be constrained by local landscape structure, leading to a greater likelihood that, say, most patches are small or that most are large relative to the size of the fire. As fires span larger and larger areas, the area burned is likely to be composed of a really wide range of topographies, vegetation structures, and even microclimate conditions that will lead to a really wide range of high severity patch sizes. Also, the largest fires, especially in Western Cascadia, occur under extreme weather conditions, specifically very high winds, which can drive extreme fire behavior and result in really large contiguous areas burning at high severity, which is what we see for the Beachy Creek fire here on the right. So wrapping this all up with some next steps for this project, like I said, it's still a work in progress. We're hoping next, like we did for our core area metric, to be able to simulate patch size distributions across a range of fire sizes. We have started looking into evaluating mediating factors that might influence these scaling relationships, so specifically things like fire weather and topography. And then finally, we're really looking forward to integrating this research with other ongoing research, and specifically the research that's parsing out climate drivers of fire size in Western Cascadia. So with that, I will stop talking. Thank you all for your time and attention, and I'm happy to take questions, feedback, suggestions, anything you might have.
Awesome job. Thanks so much, Michelle. I learned a lot about the spatial structure of fires, which I've never learned about before. So thanks
That's
for
great.
all that. And all of your maps and figures were beautiful and very pleasing. So it was a great job. Let me check if we have any questions. There are none online, but you can, of course, type questions online or raise your hand. Are there any questions in person? Stacy has a question. Let's see if you can hear her. Let me know if you can't.
Okay.
I was just going to say, this was a great talk. Thank you, Michelle. It was really, really cool to hear all of this. I was going to ask, you've thought a lot about how fires happen spatially and how that changes with these shifting regimes. I'm curious if you've thought about time specifically with how intensity might shift in a directional kind of pattern where things become more severe, but also how some areas might become more variable in the amount of severity that happens, and some years might not be severe and other years might be more severe.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So two sort of questions that I got there. One is how have I thought about how these spatial patterns might be changing in time? And then the other question is whether they might be becoming more variable in time. Do I have that right? Okay. Yeah, we've explored the question of whether these spatial patterns are changing in time a couple of ways, and I specifically explored whether the relationship between fire size and each of those metrics was changing. And I haven't found any evidence yet to suggest that those relationships are changing in time. I will caveat that we are working with a fairly limited temporal window. So we're working with 1984 to 2020. So it's about 30 years, which is a good start. But climate is continuing to change. And so we might see shifts in these relationships moving forward. And then the variability question, yeah, that is really interesting and something that I think I'm trying to parse out through this quantile regression approach by considering not only whether, say, like the median patch size, for example, might be changing over time, but also whether that overall range might be changing and widening. And so that's why using the approach where I was looking at those quantile specific curves and whether they varied by time period, I was really interested in the upper and lower bounds of the distributions and whether they might be widening or shifting in some direction over time. And again, we haven't found any evidence for that in the satellite record, but that's not to say moving forward as conditions intensify that won't happen.
Thank you.
Cool. She says thanks. I have a question. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more why you chose the quantile regression. I'm not really familiar with that, and I'm like, how is that different from a GAM or something like that? I was just wondering if you could explain it a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I was really interested in again, capturing that full range of variability and potential responses or potential spatial metrics. And initially I was looking at, I started out simple linear regression or like some sort of nonlinear regression, but what I found pretty quickly is that the distribution or the variance in errors from that expected value, that variation in errors changed quite a bit with fire size. I mean, part of that is that we're doing all of this on a log scale. And so that makes things a little bit wonky too. But I saw quite quickly that just looking at the central tendency, even using something like a GAM, probably wouldn't be appropriate because we wouldn't be capturing the range of variation and how that range of variation is changing with fire size. And so I sort of stumbled across the quantile regression functions or approach quite recently, and I like it because it is quite flexible, and it does explicitly account for that full range of variation. And so at any given fire size, we can fully describe what, from the 95th down to, the 2.5th quantiles, what that potential response might be, which I think is really important for managers working in this region.
Cool, thank you so much. Oh, we have a follow-up to that question.
Can you hear me, Michelle?
I can, hold on, I can hear, yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, I thought the quantile regression was really cool. I was, interested to see how it looks as you keep going. I'm not super familiar with non-parametric approaches, but I guess my limited understanding is that they generally have lower power relative to parametric approaches. And I think you mentioned at one point that your residuals aren't normal or whatever. But did you explore parametric quantile regression at all?
I did. I explored a linear quantile regression approach, and even explored some nonlinear approaches as well. The problem that you run into sometimes when using a parametric approach is that the quantile curves that get fit to the distribution end up crossing at some point, depending on how each of those individual quantile curves is fit, which obviously doesn't make sense if you're trying to describe the distribution of the response and your estimated 95th percentile is below your median. That's just sort of nonsensical. And so another benefit of the non-parametric approach in the specific package that I'm using in R is that it enforces these non-crossing constraints, so that your 50th percentile estimate is always going to be lower than your 95th, for example, which is a really important constraint, I think, again, for these relationships.
Cool.
Thanks. We have one online. Eli, your hand is raised. I'll unmute you, even though you asked the question.
Hi, thanks, Michelle. It's a really great talk. This is maybe kind of unrelated, but I'm wondering if you saw any evidence of any kind of discontinuity when you're getting up towards the large size. I'm just thinking about the behavior that can happen when fires are really large, that they become kind of self-sustaining. Like you get these fire tornadoes or fire storm effects. So, I imagine it may be it gets to a certain size, it's doing one thing, and then when it gets really large, it's it just behaves fundamentally differently.
Yeah, so in general, I wouldn't say that I've noticed any discontinuities per se. I will say I have struggled quite a bit with the fact that I think those larger fires, because they're most impactful, are really what we're most interested in. However, that is where our data are most sparse. So there's just a lot of uncertainty in that portion of the distribution. I have noticed, thinking of discontinuities though, specifically in the patch sizes. So going back to this figure here, when we get those really large fires, particularly in Western Cascadia, they're typically occurring under extreme weather conditions, and they're contagious processes, right? So these crown fires, we call them, when the fire gets up into the canopy and really like takes off, those patterns and processes can sort of explode, like you were saying, under these conditions. And we get these really large contiguous high severity patches like you see here, where most of the trees are killed. And so that behavior is a little bit, well, it's very unpredictable, and it's hard to capture in our patch size distributions in a way that we can, it's just very uncertain, I think, is what I'm trying to say. And so that's something that we've struggled with quite a bit.
Thanks. Mark has a question.
Hi, Michelle. Mark Sherrill here. What can you tell me how fighting activities affects this type of analysis, either spatially or temporally? Like, do different states have different, rationale for what fires they fight and where, and how has that changed over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's more complicated in drier forest systems where fire has historically been more frequent, because, as I mentioned, fire suppression has really altered fire activity in those regions. And so, there's been a lot of effort to try to reintroduce fire into those landscapes to try to restore them to historical conditions and restore fire activity to, historical levels as well. In an area like Western Cascadia, which is, very historically has been very cool and moist, fire suppression has had much less of an impact on fire activity, and there are fewer potential negative consequences of suppressing fire in a region like Western Cascadia, because we're not worried about accumulation of fuels. These forests are naturally very dense and biomass rich. And so I would say fire suppression in Western Cascadia specifically is a strategy that is used whenever possible, as compared to a drier system where, under certain conditions, they may allow a fire to burn, because if it's as long as it doesn't totally get away, it can help, again, restore those landscapes to their historical range of variability.
Cool. Thanks so much, Michelle. We're a little bit past the time, so I want to acknowledge people's times. But thank you so much, Michelle, for giving an awesome talk. It was great, and I'm excited to see what else you do with that in your future steps. So thanks again, and hope everyone can enjoy the sunshine this weekend.
Thank you.
Have a good one.